Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today we are diving into topic 3.1 of the IBDP ESS syllabus, which covers biodiversity and evolution. If you want to refer to the previous video, you can find the link in the description below. Now let's start with 3.1. In this subtopic, we are going to understand the definition of biodiversity, its different types, and we are also going to see how the evolutionary process generates biodiversity, what are the different quantitative measures which we have, and what are the role of human activity in both reducing and reshaping biodiversity across geological time. Mostly this topic discuss around this guiding question, like how diversity can be explained and quantified, and why it is important at first place, and how does the unsustainable use of natural resources impact biodiversity. So first let's understand what is biodiversity. So if you'll break the word biodiversity, bio means living and diversity means variety. So biodiversity is the variety in living organism. Now that exists at several levels. Level 1 is genetic diversity, level 2 is species diversity, and level 3 is ecosystem diversity. Okay, so let's understand first the species diversity. Now, species diversity means what? You have a number of different varieties of species present, right? We have different varieties of flowers, we have different varieties of trees, we have different varieties of organisms, we have different varieties of fruits. Okay, so all this constitutes species diversity. Now, in species diversity, we have two things. First is richness, and the another thing is evenness. Now, what is this richness and evenness? So, richness means the number of species which we have. Okay, like if you have 100 species of a particular butterflies, right? So we can say that the richness is 100. Okay, so we have suppose um, different varieties of a particular plant, then we can say that this much richness is present. Evenness means in that richness or in that species variety, how many number of an organism is present. Okay, so that constitutes the evenness. Okay, so what's the relative abundance which is there, that we call it as evenness. So now if you say a tropical rainforest, then we know that it has a high richness, right? You have 50% of world species on just a 7% of an land. But if you talk about the temperate forest, you have a lower richness, right? But it is critical for an ecosystem services. Okay. Now the another thing which you need to understand is about the habitat diversity. Okay. Now because we have different varieties of an habitat, we have different species also which can survive in those environment. Okay, so these are all interconnected. It's never like that you have a very high species diversity but very low habitat diversity. No, that is not possible. Because you have variety of physical environment, because you have different abiotic conditions, we have different habitats. We have forest, wetlands, deserts, reefs, everything, right? We have estuaries. Now estuaries is again, it's a very interesting we can say habitat, because it is a transition between an ocean and a fresh water, right? And it is considered to be an area where you can find a high biodiversity, and it is always very rich. So that's how that you have a different habitats, different conditions are there, and that's why different organisms can survive. The another thing is we have different genetic diversity also, right? Now how a species diversity comes into existence, it can't be possible without the variation in genes, right? So there comes the genetic diversity, like you can see variation of genes within an individuals and population of a species. Like in cheetah we have low genetic diversity, then it is vulnerable to disease. In coral reefs you have high genetic diversity, and that's why they are resilient to temperature change. So it is said that we should have a more genetic diversity because that will help in making an ecosystem more resilient to a sudden change. So if there is a higher habitat diversity, we have high species diversity, and if you have high species diversity, that means you have higher genetic diversity. Now, the another understanding is that how these components of diversity contributes to resilience. So, in previous video, we have discussed the term resilience. It is the ability to absorb the disturbance and return to the equilibrium. Depends on biodiversity at all three levels. Okay, so if you have more genetic diversity, more species diversity, more habitat that types, then ultimately it helps in maintaining the resilience, because more genetic variation means there is more chance that some individuals survive new threats. If you have more species, then it is possible that if one species is lost due to any reason, others will fill its ecological role. And if you have more habitat types, then there is a high chance that it will recover faster from the fire, flood, or drought condition. So more varieties of species, habitat, genetic, you will see more complex food webs can be formed, and ultimately it results into a greater stability. In previous session we have also discussed about succession, that how a climax community which is considered to be a highly biodiverse are more resilient than a pioneer communities which are low in diversity. Now how the biodiversity arises? Okay, now there are different processes. Okay, earlier it was not like that. If you see, like thousands of years back, we did not have this much biodiverse areas. We have a very few species or varieties of an organism. Then how this arises? Now there are different processes which are responsible. We call it as an evolutionary processes. The first one is mutation. Now what is mutation? So mutation is the random change in DNA, most neutral or harmful, but some are beneficial also. And that mutation, which is the change in the genetic sequences, that results into the creation of new alleles. Now alleles are the forms of a genes, right? So that's how even though you have a same genes, but the alleles are different, and that's why the expression differs. Okay, so like if you see butterfly, right, the butterfly has a same gene, right, a color gene is same, but still you will find different colors of butterfly. So that is because of the new alleles. Now how that new alleles came into existence? It occurs through mutation. The another thing is gene flow. So movement of gene between population via migration and interbreeding, that also increases the genetic diversity and reduces the differences between population. So whenever there is this migration happening, whenever there is an interbreeding happening, there is a chances that the two species exchange their genetic material, and that results into the diversity in the upcoming offsprings. The another term is genetic drift, which is a random change in gene frequencies, especially in the small population. Now that genetic drift is sometimes reduces the diversity, and sometimes the trait may spread or disappear by chance. The another thing is natural selection, which again very well known concept in evolution, where the individual which has some kind of an advantageous trait will survive and will reproduce more, and the one which are less adapted to the environment, they will die. So that's how we'll also understand this process in detail when we are studying speciation, that how a formation of new species occurs. So these are the different processes by which the biodiversity arises. Now another mechanism which are responsible, like as we have discussed in the previous slide, is like about natural selection. So let's study that process in detail. So natural selection is, like we as we have discussed, that it is something where the organism who are better adapted to their environment will survive, flourish, and reproduce more successfully than those which are less well adapted. So there comes the survival of fittest. Now here there is very classic example given about the industrialization. So what is happening in pre-industrial state and what was happening in the post-industrial state. Okay, so during pre-industrial state there was no, or you can say there was very less pollution. Okay, so this is the example of the tree trunk, where in first image the pollution was not there, and that's why the it was just a natural color of the tree trunk which was there. But in due to pollution and due to the presence of soot, which is a black colored material coming from the industries, that has darkened this trunk area. Now in environment there were two varieties of moth. We have a light colored moth, and we also had the dark melanic moth. In both the cases we had this, right? Now what was happening, that during the pre industrial state, the dark moth, because it was darker in color, they were not able to camouflage with the natural environment, and that's why they were easily spotted by the predators and being consumed by them. And because of that, the light colored moth were got a benefit of its color, and they were better camouflage with the environment, and that's why they survived. But during the time of post industrial, so now industrial pollution kills the lichens and it has darkened this tree bark, and because of that the effective camouflage for melanic moth, that is the dark melanic moth, were able to survive, and the typical moths become vulnerable to predation, and that's why it was being consumed by the predator. So just the industrial pollution kills lichens and it darkens the tree bark, and it provides an effective camouflage for melanic moth, and then it becomes vulnerable to predation. So that's a very classic, very like a case study which has been discussed many a times. So the key lesson here is, when the environment change, the direction of the selection reverses, and evidence that natural selection is always driven by the current conditions. So how the mechanism of natural selection occurs? So we know that environment is responsible, but how, what kind of changes occurs? Okay, now the first and foremost step is variation. Now what is variation? It is individual which differs in traits like size, color, behavior due to genetic diversity. So that provides the raw material for the selection. Now because of this variation, the characteristics which was giving benefit, because of that the overproduction of that species starts to hamper. Okay, so species will produce more offspring that then can survive, and that lead to the competition for limited resources. So there occurs of first of all overproduction, then there will be a competition between the individuals with advantageous trait and with the non advantageous trait, and then the one which has the advantages survive, and that we call it as survival of fittest. And then the survivor will produce more, and it will pass the offspring to the advantageous trait. The another thing is heritability. So advantageous trait will then inherit their genes into the offspring. So here all 5 steps are required you to explain whenever you are asked to write about natural selection and how does that happen. So just make sure that you are explaining the title, what is actually happening, and what are the consequences of the state. Now speciation. Now what is speciation? Speciation is the process of formation of new species. And how does that happen? It happens through a reproductive isolation. Now reproductive isolation means what? When a particular group of an organism belonging to a one species gets separated by some or the other reason, and when they are being separated and when they are evolved differently in a different environment, then there is a chance that now these two species which was originally the same species evolved into a two different species, because now they are not able to breed, and that's why they are diverged into a different species and they are no longer able to interbreed. So classic example about this is Galapagos finches, a very like common, highly studied example where there was this finches. Uh, Originally, we call it as an ancestor species. Now, these species, which is scientific name is Geospiza fuliginosa, this species is a seed-eating ground finch, but then over time this species evolved into a four different varieties of a species, with all four having a different eating habits. Okay, now how this evolution have happened? It is because this there was this geographical isolation which has happened, and that geographical isolation resulted into their different food sources, and because of their different food sources they have evolved into a different beak shapes, and that's why we had a 13 plus distinct species, each adapted to a specific niche. And that's a example of an adaptive, or you can say adaptive radiation. What the name only suggesting that they are evolved by adapting certain conditions. So because of this geographical isolation, this species was separated, and all the species evolved into a different habits, different beak sizes, different food habits, and they evolved into a different organisms. So in one of first slide, I guess I have discussed about richness and evenness. So richness, the total number of different species in an area, and evenness is the abundance of each species. Now, why does this matter? It matters because two ecosystems can have the same richness but very different evenness. And an ecosystem with one species dominates is less resilient than the one with balanced abundances. So high richness plus high evenness both are required for maximum biodiversity. So we just can't say that if a particular ecosystem have more number of an organism than the other ecosystem, then that means that is highly biodiverse. We can't say that. We have to take consideration of species richness as well as evenness when you want to calculate which ecosystem is biodiverse. And we do this thing with the help of Simpson diversity index, where we take values of richness and evenness both, and then we get the final value which tells us whether the ecosystem is biodiverse or not. That's where I was talking. It's a Simpson diversity index where you just have to put the values. In exam, this sometimes they give the formula, so you don't have to remember, but you should know how to calculate this. So the values will be given to you, and they will tell you just have to put the values and calculate it. Just make sure that sometimes students make an error forgetting to square the fractions and everything, so just make sure that you are not doing any silly mistakes, and that's what, yeah, you get the right value. So biodiversity knowledge and conservation, how does we get that knowledge? How as a human or as a person, how can we get the biodiversity knowledge? So we get it through citizen science, where we are actually volunteering public, we are recording species sightings, we are monitoring ecosystems, and through that we get the knowledge whether this the population of certain species is getting down or not, what kind of conservation strategies we can implement. We can also gather information from governments and NGOs, where we are actually remote sensing, we are doing field surveys, we are monitoring a particular species, we are seeing whether this species is in an endangered zone or an critically endangered zone, and then we are putting some efforts to conserve it. And the another method is through an indigenous and parabiologist, where the local ecological knowledge we gather and then we combine it with the scientific methods, and we then train the community members to collect data. What are the conservation strategies? which are informed by knowledge, so we can have a protected areas where we are trying to identify the regions which has high ecological value, and like Amazon reserves or Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and through that strategy we are trying to conserve the species. We can do put fishing quotas or forestry practices, or we can do water management. We can see whether the fish which people are consuming, is it a certified one or not, is it being harvested using sustainable methods or not. Now we have those labeling where we can just being mindful about whenever you are buying anything, just being mindful about whether this is MSC certified sustainable fisheries or not. You can be a responsible citizen, and you can make sure that the your actions doesn't impact the biodiversity. And then we have the species recovery program, where the population and genetic data guides captive breeding and habit restoration. Like example is California condor, black-footed ferret recovery. So there are many techniques, many conservation methods which we are using to, you know, increase the population of species. Now this is an HL content where there is little bit deeper how mutation and sexual reproduction increases genetic diversity. So in mutation we have seen that how there is this random change in the sequence, and now it is not, it can be like naturally or spontaneously happening, or it can be because of a mutagen. Now mutagen are certain chemicals which are responsible for causing mutation, and these sometimes can beneficial to the people or to the community, or it can sometimes harmful, or it can be neutral. So mutation is something which is happening, and it's just that sometimes it can lead to a harmful effect, or it can lead to the beneficial effect. The another way by which the genetic diversity is increasing is through a sexual reproduction, like meiosis. Chromosomes exchange material, and so meiosis is again a way of where it happens in sexual reproduction, where there is this exchange of genetic material between the two individual, and that also results into the exchange of chromosome, and then the offspring has a unique genotype. So that's how the changes happen. The another thing which you need to understand is about the reproductive isolation. Now it is achieved by geographical isolation, like when a population is living in the same area, but then due to some reason, like if some river has start to pass between them and suddenly the population is separated, then this is a type of a geographical isolation. Now it is a physical barrier. Okay, so geographical isolation is also known as allopatric speciation, where a mountain, river, ocean prevents gene flow between the population. Example is bonobos and chimpanzees, which are separated by the Congo River. They evolved independently and resulted into a different social structures and genetics. We have another type of an isolation which is known as sympatric isolation, where there is no physical barrier or something, but they are isolated by a ecological niche or behavioral differences. The example is apple maggot fly shifted to apple trees, so they have a different fruiting times, and there is this reproductive isolation within a generation which have happened. So this is just that the population is in the same environment, but maybe there is some seasonal change or some certain change which happened, and that results into the isolation into a different species. The another thing is parapatric isolation, where there is a continuous range but individuals mate locally. Environmental gradient drives divergence. So it's like when you have a grass species along a mine, toxicity gradient to tolerate and non-tolerate population diverges. So this is again a very common example. You can see that whenever there is this industrial area or something like that, in that area you will find variation in the species which are living there, because they are adapted to those conditions, and that's why they are surviving. So there is a high chances that you will see certain variety in them, which was earlier not present. So isolated islands always have an high endemism, which means that endemism word came from an endemic species, which are species which are found only in that area and nowhere else. So that is an endemism. And Galapagos finches is like a 13 plus species which are formed from one ancestor. And Madagascar lemurs, they are again 100 species, all endemic, evolved in isolation for 60 million years ago. You will find lemurs only in Madagascar region. So that's how the reproductive isolation works. Now, biodiversity is spread unevenly across the planet. Okay, there are certain population where you will find very high biodiversity. There are certain area where you find very low biodiversity. Now, again, it depends on the environment. As we have discussed in the previous video, where we have talked about different biomes. Now, there are certain biomes which are, you know, they have this tendency that they are having a high biodiversity. Okay, their temperature, their rainfall, their soil moisture, or the environment, the abiotic conditions in that environment is in such a manner that they, you know, make sure that the all the species flourish there. So larger habitat supports more species, and we call it as hotspots generally. So hotspots are that area which are, you know, higher in species richness and endemism. And examples are tropical rainforest and coral reefs, which has a higher biodiversity. Now, why humans, you know, it's a big culprit behind an evolutionary change, because humans are involved in different activities like hunting, poaching, urbanization, agriculture, climate change, and all this factor is a kind of a selective pressure for the species. And you know, that is actually triggering the species to, you know, express or adapt to the situation, and this may lead to the mutation, and then this mutation can result into the formation of new species. So hunting, poaching, and everything all targets individuals with specific traits. Like when hunting happens, it is because of the large tusk, and that will reduce the trait reduction or loss in population. Urbanization, new hazard, altered food sources, novel habitat, and because of that there is this behavioral adaptation and diet shifts which has seen agriculture, where we are using pesticides and everything. So this is making a habitat more simpler. So we you can find certain organisms which are pest resistant. Climate change, a very common issue which results into a biome shift. So all these factors are actually driving the evolutionary change. Artificial selection reduces genetic diversity and consequently species resilience. So sometimes it happens that because we want certain type of an organism, we generally breed an organism for the desired trait, and that process is called artificial selection. While commercially useful, but it drastically narrows the gene pool. For example, Cavendish banana. So this was selected because it has a good size and taste, and it has this seedlessness, and because of that they have created this genetically identical clone, like Panama disease, which threatens global production. We have a commercial wheat which is highly yield uniform growth, but it is again vulnerable to new fungal strain because it relies on chemical inputs. We have domestic dog breeds because of its appearance and temperament, but that has inherited health problems like breathing in bulldogs, hip dysplasia. So that's how artificial selection sometimes decreases by imposing a single narrow set of an criteria. Now, early history extends over a period of 4.5 billion years. Processes that occur over an extended time scale have led to the evolution of life on Earth. So this is how when the Earth was formed, this when the first life came into existence, and this is the year when there is this Cambrian explosion have happened, and that has resulted into a rapid diversification. This is the time when the dinosaurs get extinct, and these are the time when the Homo sapiens appeared, where you call it as a fraction of a second in a geological time. So these are the processes that build the biodiversity. It took billions of years, and human impact is altering this biodiversity in decades. So the order at which this happening is very fast in because of human impact, compared to how the evolution have actually took a time. These are the early Earth history, which is being divided into a geological epoch according to the fossil record. So, Precambrian, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic, these are all the epoch. So, generally, geologists use the boundary markers in rock layers where if there is any sudden change happened in the fossil, then they have named it in with a certain epoch. So, the fossil record is the primary archive of Earth's biological history. These are the time when mass extinctions have happened in the history. You can see here during Endo-Ordovician, there were around 85% species lost. In the Cretaceous time, there is 76% loss, and there are different likely causes. Again, not an exact one, likely causes it happened. So, but why the problem, people are concerned about this mass extinction, because it is said that the last mass extinction is the Anthropocene, which is because of the human and led by human activity, because the current extinction rate is 100 to 1000 times more than background extinction rate, and that's why people are concerned in conserving species and everything. The kind of carbon dioxide level rising or the land usage which we are doing, these all factors are actually creating a rapid environmental change, and that is something where we need to take care. So, human impacts are having a planetary effect which will be detectable in the geological record. These are all the human impact like carbon dioxide emissions, plastic pollution, nuclear fallout, species extinction. These are all is a you know happening. You can see how ocean acidification is increasing, and this is how they will. So in exam they may ask you to connect this ecological effect with their geological signatures to show the understanding at the system level. So just make sure that you give proper examples and explain your question, because human impacts are something, it is there in every chapter, and there is a high chance that they will ask you about the human impacts. These are the essential vocabularies which you need to use when you are writing your answer. These are the key takeaways and exam tips. You should know what is the relationship between genetic species and habitat diversity. You should know how diversity leads to resilience. You should know the process of natural selection and isolation, and how Simpson diversity index will be calculated. There is this 9-mark essay tip where you are asked to write to link biodiversity with both ecosystem services and ecosystem or evolutionary processes. So just make sure that you are using case studies. These are very common case studies, like we have discussed Galapagos finches and the peppered moth. So you can use the case study while framing your answer to get more marks. And yeah, that's all from my end. In next class, we will study topic 3.2. Thank you.